Our reading this morning is from the poet Pablo Neruda. It's entitled Keeping Quiet. Now we will count to 12, and we will all keep still for once on the face of the earth. Let's not speak in any language. Let's stop for a second and not move our arms so much. It would be an exotic moment without rush, without engines. We would all be together in a sudden strangeness. Fishermen in the cold sea would not harm whales, and the men gathering salt would not look at their hurt hands. Those who prepare green wars, wars with gas, wars with fire, victories with no survivors, would put on clean clothes and walk about with their brothers in the shade, doing nothing. What I want should not be confused with total inactivity. Life is what it is about. If we were not so single-minded about keeping our lives moving and for once could do nothing, perhaps a huge silence might interrupt this sadness of never understanding ourselves and of threatening ourselves with death. Now I'll count up to 12, and you keep quiet, and I will go. We have reached the long, hot middle of summer, when all I want to do is sprawl in the shade or air conditioning like a lizard lies in the sun. I want to lie about anti-sunning myself, moving as slowly as thick honey reflects the light. I want to sit like a stone in a cool creek bed and let the cold water move all around me. This is not the season for rushing or overtaxing ourselves. It is a season of slow unfolding and hopefully delight. The peaches are ripe and juicy. The watermelons are swollen and sweet. The tomatoes are round and reddening. The world is abundant and replete, and we could be too, if we would just allow ourselves the time and space to do some good lazing about. We've reached the season when that's what I want to do, laze about. Move through my days with wonder and attention and slow delight. I want to rest in the grace of the world, like Wendell Berry says. I want to rest in the grace of the world and be free. Yet I have this voice in my racing mind, this voice in my restless legs, this voice in my longing heart saying that slowness is death and work is meaning, and I gotta keep moving even if there's nowhere to go. And maybe you feel similarly sometimes. And if you do, I have good news. That voice is the voice of the oppressor, and there is a blessed stillness waiting just beneath it. A love that holds us, a worth we need not create or earn, and couldn't if we tried. There is a blessed stillness, and we can access it by slowing down our racing bodies, hearts, and minds. For this reason, I have come to believe that lazing about is a high spiritual practice, and taking leisure seriously is good for our collective liberation. To support this belief, I want to get into the phrase at the heart of my title this morning, lazing about. I chose it carefully because it has all kinds of baggage, and y'all know I like to play with uncomfortable language. The word lazy first appeared in English in the 1540s, and it was used to mean someone who disliked work or effort. Many etymologists believe it came from either the Middle Low German Lassig, which meant feeble or weak, or from the Old English lesu, which meant false or evil. Social psychologist Devin Price, who researches and writes on the concept of laziness, points out in his book, Laziness Does Not Exist, that the idea that lazy people are weak or lack motivation, making them morally corrupt and evil, is still with us today and manifests powerfully in such oppressions as white supremacy, ableism, weight stigma, and hatred of those who are poor and unhoused. All of these oppressions carry tropes about people being less than in ways they could solve if they would only work harder. This, of course, is a big lie. It is oppression that oppresses people, not a lack of their own effort. Price calls this the laziness lie. And he dates it back to the origins of the word lazy in English in the 1540s, because guess what else appeared in England around the 1540s alongside the word lazy? Our spiritual forebears of blessed and infamous memory, the Puritans. In his book, Price traces the origin of what he calls the laziness lie to the theological position of our Puritan forebears who settled in the U.S. in the 1600s. He writes, they believed hard workers were predestined for salvation, and anyone they deemed lazy was damned. This conflation of hard work and moral worth was later used as justification for slavery and exploitive labor practices in the Industrial Revolution. The concept of laziness was created as a theological idea and then used to justify almost every oppression we can think of. Whether the Puritans were the true progenitors of this concept, conflating moral worth with work, or whether they were simply caught up in the supremacist assumptions of their day, the idea that work and human worth were one and the same took hold and still holds sway as a powerful sort of nationalist theology in our late capitalist nation state. When we hear the words lazing about, chances are that many of our brains immediately sort that phrase into the bad bucket. Lazing? That's not something I want to be seen doing. Lazy? I don't want to be perceived that way. And indeed, I realized a few years back that when someone close to me would ask me how my day was, and I wanted to give more than the perfunctory answer of, fine, I would usually say something like, oh, it was good. I had a really productive day. Or, ugh, it was a rough day. I felt so unproductive. And that wasn't just a turn of phrase. That was really how I felt and how I categorized my days. That was my assumption about what it made a day good or bad, how I felt about whether a day was good or bad. Was it productive? Did I mark off my to-do list? Yikes. And I'm not trying to say that we should not feel satisfied for accomplishing things. My to-do list is genuinely satisfying to me. And there are things to do amid our days on this earth. There is plenty to do. But wow, have we organized ourselves around the doing. And wow, do we find ourselves at loose ends or even anxious and depressed when we turn our attention to just being. And what if that culture around doing represents a collective consent to the laziness lie, to the assumptions of contemporary capitalism that our bodies and their energies are units of capital, worth only what work can be extracted from them? The questions begin to feel awfully existential. I begin to see the theological stakes of taking back the word lazy and the act of being lazy. Could that be the way I insist that my worth is not earned by work, and neither is yours? In response to the oppressive theologies that deny and extract our worth, one could begin to see lazing about as an effective resistance to systems that dehumanize. One could imagine opting into laziness as an act of solidarity with those whose bodies cannot or will not obey the pace that supremacy systems demand. One could connect the dots between a commitment to lazing and a deep theology of human worth, abundance, and sufficiency. One could even observe the insistence on perpetual doing, achieving, and economic growth as a primary driver of climate crisis, and conclude that laziness is what will save the earth. Could lazing about be not only spiritually grounding, but existentially salvific? Could less rushing and less work and more simple leisure be a way out of the mess we're in? And is there a place of just being where we can experience deeply our own inalienable worth and the consequent inherent worth of every other creature? I really hope the answer is yes. Now, I've been a rusher for a lot of years, and I've been pondering that lately, and I cannot think of any reason for it except for a deep and existential sense of insufficiency, of never having or being or doing enough. Enough for what? For my life to matter? For the limited days I have to count? That sounds like a real setup, doesn't it? And the kicker is that rushing only exacerbates the sensation of lack. Because when I rush to do more and earn more worth and be more okay, I never stop long enough to feel full, to feel replete and enough, to feel delight in this singular existence. We have created these complicated systems full of doing that require more and more doing just to keep the systems themselves running. And what if we just stopped? You know, of course, we did just stop for a very short time when global pandemic forced us to. And perhaps you heard the stories about pockets of the earth that started to heal themselves before the insistence of the extractive economy sped us back up again as soon as it could. And perhaps you began to feel yourself still and breathe. And perhaps you experienced the fullness of your life, especially when it all felt so at risk. And then perhaps you felt rushed to pick the pace right back up. I know I did. There's a lie out there akin to the laziness lie, which is the busyness lie, that all of this working and striving is somehow required for us to live. All of this rushing, all of this doing all the time, all of this driving ourselves to the bone. But it's not our survival that requires all this work. It's the massive growth forever economic systems that require it, that are killing us and that are killing the earth. Human survival has actually been accomplished across millennia with a lot less work and a lot more lazing about. In his massive treatise called Work, A History of How We Spend Our Time, anthropologist James Sussman looks at the story of work from the Stone Ages to the present. And he finds that for the vast majority of human history, people have survived by working far less than our contemporary understanding of what a working life should require. He points out that the contemporary pace and volume of human work dates back only to the Industrial Revolution, and that prior to that time, humans worked anywhere from a fair amount less to a whole lot less than we work now. Indeed, he speculates from anthropological study that our ancient hunter-gatherer ancestors worked for their sustenance about 3 hours a day. They spent the rest of their time socializing, resting, telling stories, making music and art, playing games, and generally lazing about. Now, Sussman is not arguing that we can or should go back to hunter-gatherer times or culture, and neither am I. But his presentation of the history of work does make a strong case that we could be working a lot less, and that maybe we should. Maybe our souls would benefit. Maybe our earth would too. Now, does all of this sound interesting, maybe even extremely appealing, and also totally impossible to you? Me too. The system we live in now has claimed godlike status, Doing, doing, doing is our national and perhaps even global theology, and that is not going to change wholesale, altogether, or at once. We have to live in the world we're in. There's no doubt about that. I'm not actually suggesting revolution here, just spiritual practice. What if it all begins to shift simply by each of us creating a daily, achievable practice, say 30 minutes of lazing about? Maybe eventually we could set aside a day here and there, like a lazy retreat. Maybe the spaciousness we would find, the stillness, would have such power and joy for us that it would continue to grow and grow. Here's what I can imagine. You find the time that you have to commit to spiritual practice, and for that time, you take your laziness seriously. You make it a practice to turn your attention close in, focus on the simple pleasures of the body, and slow your pace way, way down. Literally, for that time, walk across the room more slowly or move your arms more slowly. Ask yourself, what would feel good right now in this exact moment? Do that thing at a leisurely pace. And then ask yourself in the next moment, what would feel good now? And do that slowly. Keep going for whatever time you've set aside, one lazy moment at a time. You can set a timer if you need to, although I hope you let it stretch out a bit longer than you intend. I can tell you what I have experienced from some concerted practice lazing about. Your discoveries will probably be different. One thing I've noticed for myself when I devote time to lazing is that time expands the more I slow down. When I practice leisure, spaciousness seems to open up magically around me, like the inside of Mary Poppins' bag, even in what is genuinely a very busy life. When I devote time to lazing, time feels more abundant. It feels more beautiful and more open. Another thing I've noticed is that the creative spirit, the greatest blessing in my life, seems to find me a lot more regularly when I am practicing laziness. I find myself seeing possibility, juicy words and phrases bloom into my mind when I'm lying around. I've been doing a lot of writing in bed. A final thing about lazing about that I've noticed is that it is radicalizing me. I want this enoughness for everyone. I want this abundance that I'm experiencing to shape the whole world. This lazy space is tearing a hole in the Oz-like screen of systems that want to appear omnipresent, and I can begin to just glimpse another world that is still and slow and breathing right here beneath us. And I think that glimpse is where it all starts. Will we all suddenly opt into 3-hour work weeks? Probably not. But will we begin to feel the abundance of human life, the abundance of our earth, the worth that is already here inside of us simply by the fact that we are here? I think we will. And I wonder what you will discover in your lazing. I hope you will try, because the sun is hot and the shade is cool, and the peaches are ripe and juicy, and the watermelons are swollen and sweet, and the tomatoes are round and reddening, and there is time, at least for a time, to just go slow and feel it all. Maybe it's time to give it a try. For now, I'm going to give Neruda the final wondering word. If we were not so single-minded in keeping our lives moving and for once could do nothing. Perhaps a huge silence might interrupt this sadness of never understanding ourselves and of threatening ourselves with death. Now I'll count up to 12, and you keep quiet, and I will go.